My name is Maya Holt. On a Tuesday that smelled like rosemary and dish soap, my mother set a plate in front of me and told me I had 30 days to move out. She said it as if reading a schedule. "We signed today," Mom Renee announced. "The house is sold. We start packing tonight. You'll need to find another place by the end of next month." Dad folded his napkin and stared at the table. My sisters filled the quiet. Kayla, 20, cocked her head like a coach about to give advice. Lily, 17, hid a grin behind her wrist. The roasting pan cooled on the stove. My fork touched porcelain and sounded too loud. "When did you decide that I asked, keeping my voice steady? Why wasn't I told?" Mom's smile was the kind that closes conversations. "There wasn't anything you needed to decide. We're downsizing. It's the practical thing to do." She took a sip. "You're 25. It's time. What about staying a little while I look?" Dad answered without looking up. "There will be new occupants. The timeline is set. You'll manage." Kayla snorted. "Everyone our age hustles." "You code right. You'll figure it out." Lily reached for more bread. No one told either of them to stop. The room slid into their familiar choreography movers, a storage unit near Kayla's campus paint colors for Lily's bigger room with light. I was present and already edited out. It hadn't started that night. It was the accumulation of small redistributions that skipped me. When Kayla turned 16, the backyard filled with lanterns and a DJ who learned her playlist. When I turned 16 5 years earlier, Dad brought home a grocery store cake and plastic forks. At 18, Kayla got a cherry red hatchback with a bow on the hood. I got a 20 and a note, "Be responsible." Summers, they posted beaches and Ferris wheels. I stayed to watch the house. They called it logistics, so I wrote myself back in. At 15, I started bagging groceries after school. Tips became a used laptop that booted with a whine. A free coding seminar met at the public library. I sat in the back row and stayed. Loops made the kind of sense families didn't. If this, then that, else do something different. I built little programs for classmates, a grade calculator, a schedule maker, a script that nudged forgetful people to actually remember. Watching something work because I had told it how felt like air. By senior year, a counselor marched us through applications in a computer lab that smelled like dust and burned coffee. I applied where I could afford and where I could dream. Thick envelopes arrived with crests. The private colleges offered partial aid that still left numbers I couldn't bend. The state university sent a thin packet and one clean promise, full tuition 4 years. I told them at dinner, still believing good news could change the weather inside our house. For a heartbeat, there were congratulations. Then I said the private schools would need help if I chose one. Dad cut his chicken into squares. "We've set aside what we can. Your mother and I are focusing on Kayla and Lily's education." He sounded gentle, as if gentleness replaced the thing itself. I nodded and told him not to worry. I had already picked the full ride. Freshman year tasted like library air and vending machine pretzels. I kept my job, then added another campus IT at 6 in the morning, unplugging and replugging, to the gratitude of professors who thought I was a wizard. I chose the early lab section no one wanted, and the late-night workshops that stitched experience where people weren't looking. Sophomore fall, in a systems class where the syllabus was more rumor than rule, a guy named Evan Quinn noticed I documented bugs like a trail map. We partnered on homework and then small tools we sold to local shops. Back home, the architecture of exclusion stayed in place. Photos bloomed on Mom's page. Kayla on a Florida court, Lily leaning into a carousel horse, ocean light. I was tagged in nothing. When my birthday came, I bought a small cake after my shift and ate it in the quiet kitchen after midnight. At 19, I hummed the last 2 words of happy birthday because sometimes ceremony needs at least one voice. Work filled the gaps. I took gigs no one else wanted, a Saturday network cleanup in a damp basement office a Sunday, installing updates while a shop owner counted the till. I learned to write calm, complete emails at odd hours. I learned to say I can meet that deadline and then meet it. Graduation arrived on a humid morning, the color of paper. I pressed a borrowed robe and drove myself to the field where the podium was already warming in the sun. Evan's parents waved me over to sit with them. My family had a conflict Lily's tournament, and Dad texted a thumbs up emoji while the valedictorian talked about velocity. Afterward, Evan's mother took pictures and insisted on lunch. The pride in her voice felt like a small, steady light where one should have been. A few days later, while I labeled folders for client code, Mom intercepted me in the kitchen the way she did when a chore needed assigning. "Now that you're finished with school," she said, "your father and I expect you to contribute." She had a notepad columned into boxes. "Rent will be $750 a month, due on the 1st. Another box. "Groceries. We'll handle basics, but you'll cover your own food." "Okay," I said, because the math made sense, and because there wasn't an answer that would be accepted besides yes. "The 1st is fine." She nodded, as if we had signed something binding. "Good." She moved to the pantry, and I stepped into the hall. We were polite strangers navigating a narrow doorway. That night, the house settled into its usual sounds, plumbing ticks. The slow sigh of the vents a footfall crossing the hallway and back. I opened my laptop and let the screen light my hands. The editor rose. The projects arranged themselves. I worked until the clock carried itself past midnight. When the notifications in the other rooms finally went silent, I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and wrote the next line. By spring, the house had learned my habits: the clatter of keys after everyone slept, the soft curse when a loop went feral, the way I padded to the sink for water, and stood in the dark counting breaths before I went back to the screen. It wasn't a plan so much as an accumulation. One night in the campus lab, Evan leaned over my shoulder, read the comments in my code, and said, "We should stop charging by the task and start building something that belongs to us." We registered an LLC with the state on a Tuesday between my morning shift in the IT office and his afternoon practicum. We named it Wayfinder Systems because everything we were making tried to get messy things from one place to another: numbers to reports, orders to shelves, intentions to actions. Our office was a sublease over a guitar repair shop that smelled like dust and lemon oil. The windows faced an alley and admitted a kind of light that made you disciplined. We set 2 mismatched desks against opposite walls and bought a whiteboard that never erased completely clean. The landlord, Mrs. Delgado, gave us a discount because the stairwell light flickered. We said thank you and kept spare bulbs in the drawer. It was not romantic. We wrote code until our eyes stung. We tested and broke and retested in the late hours when the network ran quiet. We ate the cheapest noodles and justified the occasional gas station sandwich as a celebratory expense. Evan's girlfriend Nora came by once with coffees and shook her head at our folding chairs. "This is one lightning strike away from a fire," she said. She wasn't wrong. We ran surge protectors in a neat daisy chain anyway and taped the cords to the baseboards. Our first year looked like a string of small, competent hacks. A florist needed a better way to track standing orders and seasonal perishables. A used bookstore wanted an inventory that recognized duplicates by ISBN and the way the staff spelled author names wrong. We charged enough to keep the lights on and learned to write proposals that sounded like promises we could actually keep. When we handed off a tool that worked, people paid on the spot or in a week. I learned to breathe when invoices were still processing. I learned that building something that behaved every day was a quiet kind of power. What we kept wanting, though, was a platform one spine with swappable limbs that could carry real weight. We chose supply chains not because it was glamorous, but because there were always boxes moving and people trying to predict where they'd land. We started a codebase we called Conveyor, then tore it down after 6 weeks and named the second version Mosaic because it seemed honest, small pieces deliberately placed adding up to an image. Mosaic ate our hours. We read about EDI standards until the acronyms blurred. We built adapters for the kinds of spreadsheets that people promised were always the last one, really. Evan wrote the ingestion layer like a patient at a piano, steady, precise, willing to throw away what clinked. I loved the scheduler, watching tasks queue and resolve, and report like a factory floor you could see from the sky. We posted progress notes to ourselves on the whiteboard. No cleverness where clarity will do. Name things you can pronounce at 3 a.m. We slept badly and woke like diver alarms. At home, I kept my edges smooth. I paid Mom the rent on the 1st and kept my groceries on one shelf. I said yes to Kayla's request that I drive her to the bus station at 6 one morning because her ride fell through. I brought Lily a set of colored gel pens because she liked making study guides, and I remembered being 17 with a binder that felt like identity. They said thank you without lifting their eyes from their screens. The house smelled like scented candles and whatever dinner I hadn't been asked to join. I walked past the living room where the TV glowed with travel shows, set my laptop on my bed and worked. Sophomore spring bled into summer, summer into the year after. Mosaic held. Local manufacturers started to notice because a purchasing manager told another purchasing manager over coffee that our thing made his Mondays boring, and that was high praise. We priced low for pilots delivered above the line and watched a few dashboards become necessary. The first time someone called on a Sunday, because a scheduled job had failed, I answered on the second ring and fixed it with a patch that felt like a coin flipping to heads. Then during a fall that smelled like wet leaves and new binders, a logistics director from Northline Freight asked if we could make Mosaic play nicely with their older systems. The email came at 2:11 a.m., which told me everything I needed to know about their compromise with insomnia. We met on a video call under fluorescent lights. Their people spoke in the shorthand of warehouses and routes. We showed them the ingestion layer and what the scheduler did when you asked it to orchestrate a week of arrivals and leave room for the stubborn chaos of weather and human error. When the demo ended, the director rubbed his eyes and said, "If this does what you say outside of a call, we might be in business." We put Mosaic in their sandbox. It behaved. They installed it in a pilot region. It behaved there too. Fewer paper chases, fewer delays, a feeling that the next truck arrived because the previous ones had. 3 weeks later, the director sent an email with the subject line proposal. Evan opened it, breathed once, and turned his screen to me. The number sat in the center like a dare, 2.3 M to acquire Mosaic outright, with separate consulting contracts for transition months. For a long minute, I heard the hum of the alley light and the bass line coming up through the floorboards from the guitar shop. I tried to divide the number into rational portions and failed. Evan laughed, once the dry kind you use when reality insists. "We'll need a lawyer," he said. We found a small firm with clean floors and a partner who explained contingencies without talking to us like children. The diligence period tugged at my patience, but eventually there were papers to sign and wires to clear. The morning the money landed, the bank app blinked at me like a misprint. Evan and I bought cheap burritos and ate them in the alley on the warm lip of the loading dock because the office felt too small for the size of what had occurred. "We should buy chairs that don't argue with your spine," he said. We did not. We paid taxes we had planned for retained cash for salaries and runway, and put the rest where adults told us adults put such things. We hired 2 part-time contractors and turned them full-time a quarter later. I added an accounting service because my sleep cost more than doing payroll alone. At home, I stayed predictable. I drove my dented sedan and didn't replace the faded bumper sticker. I wore the same sweaters. When Mom put a stack of moving brochures on the counter one afternoon and asked if any of us had boxes, I fetched the flattened ones from the office and left them by the garage door. She said thanks without looking up, then asked Lily whether an off-white sofa was too grown up. Kayla texted pictures of apartments near campus and held the phone for Mom to swipe. I listened like a ghost in my own scene. I hadn't planned to stay. With the pressure off, I started to look for a place where the air made sense on purpose. I doodled floor plans in the margins of my notebook's sunlight, on a west wall, a table big enough for maps and takeout, a corner for the whiteboard. We would retire from Wayfinder when we moved downstairs to a proper suite. On a Saturday when code compiled clean and the sky had that unstoppable blue October sometimes carries. I opened a real estate site and lost time. A listing appeared with a picture of a brick facade I knew like a face. The siding had been power washed. The maple tree in front wore early color like a scarf. The photographer had stood in our driveway and tilted the lens just so, cropping out the oil stain where Kayla's friend had parked badly last winter. I clicked anyway. The kitchen counters shone. The living room looked bigger without the old brown sectional. The last photo was a bedroom with a narrow desk, a stack of programming books, and a laptop I recognized down to the sticker in the corner. My throat did something it usually reserved for smoke. The date on the listing said posted yesterday. I put my hands flat on the cheap particle board of my desk and felt every fiber of it. Then I called Evan. He picked up on the first ring. "You sound like you saw a ghost." They listed the house, I said. "Ours. There's a picture of my room." He was quiet long enough for the line to feel unstable. "You okay?" "Yes." I looked again at the photos that made my life look like staging. "I'm not surprised, but I have an idea." "Tell me." "We buy it," I said, not as me, through Wayfinder. Another quiet. "That's clean," he said finally, "and complicated. We have the capacity," I said. And no one would question a company purchasing a residential property as an investment. Short-term lease, long-term hold. There are tax reasons people do it. I heard my own voice and felt the oddness of explaining this to the only person who had seen me eat noodles at 2 a.m. I don't want a spectacle. I didn't add what I also didn't want to be asked to leave a place I had paid to be allowed to occupy. "We'll need an agent who knows how to keep their mouth shut," Evan said, "and a separate entity under the LLC so it's clean on paper." I opened a fresh document and wrote down Wayfinder Property Holdings in the corner, the way people write a name they aren't sure they'll keep. We called a broker a friend of Nora's father, liked Amira Yazdi, known for discretion, and an email style that inspired immediate compliance. She recommended a real estate attorney who wore salt and pepper hair like punctuation and told us without drama what to file and when. We set up the subsidiary, opened an account, and let the agent do the talking. Amira never looked at me like a story. She called to confirm what we wanted and what we didn't. "This will be marketed as an investment purchase with occupancy flexibility," she said, which meant whatever you needed it to mean. She sent over a draft offer that made my eyes itch with clauses. We made it aggressive, then softened just enough to look reasonable. The house had new appliances and a roof that would hold 5 winters if you were kind to it. The water heater was young, and the yard work simple. The asking price was high for the block and low for sentimental attachment. Amira said, "We'll add a timeline they can't resist." The first counteroffer came at 9 to 12 p.m. on a Wednesday. I was at my desk at home, the usual hum in the vents, Mom comparing paint chips in the next room. I read the number, forwarded it to Evan and Amira, and wrote back, "Split the difference, retain inspection, and I want a 45-day close." Amira called. "45 is tight for them," she said. "They're doing a contingent purchase." I pictured brochures leaning against the toaster. 45, I said. "Offer rental back if they need 2 weeks." My voice was calm, the way code was calm when you gave it clear inputs. By Friday, we had a signed acceptance with a 6-week close and a short rent-back clause no one would probably use. The inspection was clean except for a handrail that wobbled, which the sellers fixed in a day. The appraiser came and left in 9 minutes and produced a number that satisfied the bank and the ego. I kept my mouth shut at dinner, while talk shifted from whether to move to when to move. The house changed in increments. Boxes showed up that used to live flat in the garage rafters. Mom wrote fragile in a neat hand on a dozen cardboard faces. Dad made trips to a storage unit and returned smelling like concrete and old tape. Kayla dragged a suitcase down the hall and let it bump the baseboards. Lily tried paint colors on poster board and held them against the light. I ordered takeout and ate at my desk and carried my plates to the sink at midnight with the grace of an intruder. School calendars determined some of the timeline. So did lenders and the awkward choreography of overlapping closings. The date solidified the way ice does, first a film, then a thickness you couldn't ignore. Amira emailed confirmations with subject lines that sounded like decisions clear to close wire instructions. Final walkthrough. I copied the documents into a folder with subfolders labeled by date because that's how I stay sane. Evan signed things from his side, sent me a picture of his pen still hovering, raised an eyebrow in the frame, as if to say, "We are really doing this." On the night before the closing, I came home later than usual. The house smelled like cardboard and lemon cleaner. The dining table was stripped of its usual centerpiece. Only a pen and a list lay there, a spine of times and tasks. Movers, 8 WAM, utilities final readings, keys, bundle and label. Mom and Dad stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, talking in low voices. I heard the cadence before the words. "She'll land somewhere," Mom said. "She has to." Dad answered with a sigh that had decades in it. "She will," he said. It's time. I could have misheard. I could have stepped into the room and asked them to include me in their verbs. Instead, I walked past softly as if they were strangers in a public place I happened to share. In my room, the desk lamp made a clean circle of light on the wood. I set my bag down, took out the closing packet, and read through it one more time, line by line, like code I couldn't afford to get wrong. At 11, Amira texted a simple, "See you in the morning." I turned off the lamp, lay down fully clothed, and listened to the house breathe the vents, the settling, the shape of it holding. I set an alarm for 7, and let the darkness fold back over everything it recognized. Morning carried the smell of paper and coffee into the title office. A FICA sulked in the corner. A receptionist smiled the way people smile when they've learned to live with scanners that jam. Amira laid the packet in front of me, each tab wearing a small neon flag. The attorney pointed with a capped pen. I signed where blue arrows told me to sign. Evan's signature appeared beside mine, lean and decisive. Wires moved from one invisible place to another. Keys, too, brushed brass. One old nickel slid across the table on a ring that still remembered someone else's pocket. "Congratulations," Amira said. She wasn't a confetti person. I liked that about her. Outside, the air had the brittle brightness of early winter. I drove back on streets that knew my turns, parked in the same oil-dark groove of the driveway, and sat for a minute with my hands on the wheel. The house stood in its familiar geometry, but something had shifted behind the siding. Weight, maybe. A change in center of gravity. The front door opened on lemon cleaner and cardboard. The dining table was bare, except for a single pen, and a to-do list with boxes already checked. Movers were halfway down the hall with a bureau that had been mine until it became no one's. Then Mom's for a while, then no one's again. We nodded at each other with the mutual politeness of strangers in a narrow stairwell. In the kitchen, Dad wrapped glassware in newsprint, his fingers blackening. Mom, in a sweater I didn't recognize, tied twine around a stack of baking sheets and smoothed the knot flat. She looked up when she felt me. The look lasted half a beat, a glance that took in my bag, and the set to my shoulders, and chose to file it under later. Careful with the mirror, she told the movers, then to me, without turning. "This time, we'll be gone by noon." "I know I said because I did." Kayla passed with a backpack and a plant she'd decided wouldn't survive a move. Lily had paint swatches in her fist like a bouquet gone solemn. "Bye," she said without looking, which is how goodbyes can be too. By 11:45, the house sounded empty in places it hadn't sounded empty before. Tape peeled. Footsteps crossed and recrossed the threshold, then slowed, then stopped. Mom checked the counters with one flat hand, made a line down the refrigerator door with a paper towel, nodded to herself. Dad walked room to room and stood for a second in each doorway. They met in the hall, not touching each, reaching for keys at the same time and finding none. We shared a silent joke the universe never meant to be funny. At noon, the truck sighed and settled. Boxes breathed. Mom turned to me and tucked a loose hair into the rest. "You'll need to be out by the end of next month," she said, as if she hadn't told me already, as if repetition could laminate it. "The new owners will be here before then." "Understood." The word felt like a marble on my tongue, hard smooth, already rolling. They left without a backward glance, which I respected for its consistency. The engine noise thinned and was gone. The house clicked the way houses click when they remember how their joints fit. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against it for one measured breath. Evan arrived 20 minutes later with paper cartons that sweated through their stapled tops. "Eggplant with garlic," he said, "and spring rolls, and an irresponsible amount of ginger ale." We sat on the floor in the living room because any chair would have felt like an argument. The thermostat hummed to prove it cared. My laptop bag sat where someone might put an overnight bag if they planned to stay somewhere they weren't supposed to. We ate with chopsticks balanced on the lids because plates would have been dishonest. Halfway through a spring roll, Evan said, "How does it feel?" "Like walking into a room that used to be a photograph," I said. I took another bite so I wouldn't have to say anything else. We didn't talk about what the house had been or what it might be. We talked about the acoustic tile ceiling in the office, and whether we could get through another month before replacing it, about a vendor who had sent an invoice with a typo that served as a secret password for people who noticed. When we were done, we folded the lids closed with a kind of reverence and put the cartons in the trash like an offering. That afternoon, I opened windows so the house could exhale. I cleaned the kitchen until it stopped smelling like someone else's efforts. In the living room, the son laid a rectangle on the floor and moved it slowly toward the baseboard. I lay down in that light and let my eyes close. The house had always had this hour when it felt as if its walls held their breath and waited for a decision to be made. I didn't make one. I stood up and took a shower in water that ran hot and stayed hot. I changed the sheets on my bed and slept under them like someone who had walked a long way. In the days that followed, I learned the new distances. The empty living room made footsteps sound dishonest, so I bought a rug from a woman who sold hand-woven things out of a garage, where she also kept potted rosemary under grow lights. A carpenter on the south side built me a bookshelf from reclaimed pine. He delivered it in a truck that rattled and hauled it into place with hands that knew where weight belonged. I found a dining table, secondhand solid oak, scratched by some other family's forks, and would have kept it even if it had been uglier because it had already been useful. The only thing I bought new was a kettle that taught the water patience and a machine that pulled espresso into the kind of cup that made the first sip behave. Neighbors recalibrated. Mrs. Ellison from across the street started waving through her storm door with the cautious curiosity of someone adjusting a story. Mr. Cortez next door asked if I needed to borrow a ladder and then lent me his anyway. Packages arrived with the accuracy of a habit reasserted. The house began to speak in a voice I knew, the hallway floorboard that said hello, the kitchen cabinet that only closed on the second try, the small sigh the vents gave just before the heat arrived. I added a plant to the windowsill, and then in a moment of uncharacteristic optimism, 2 more. I put my grandmother's quilt, the only thing I owned that had crossed a century, over the back of the couch I'd found for a price that made me text Evan a photo with the caption "stolen legally." He sent back a thumbs up and a picture of the office ceiling tile drooping like a defeated argument. Work thickened. We took on 2 custom builds that required careful calendar management and a willingness to admit when the spec was a wish and not a plan. I hired our contractors full-time because it was time, and because I liked the way the office sounded when we were 3 voices in a room instead of 2. Some nights I worked at the dining table until the cursor on the screen felt like a metronome, and when I looked up, the house allowed me that too. When my 26th birthday slipped onto the calendar, I wrote my name in the square because no one else would. I invited 6 people and made 8 place settings because I have always believed in late RSVPs. Evan came early with a cake boxed in white and a line of piping that listed a little to the left. Nora arrived with an apology for the folding chairs and then sat in one without complaining. The 2 new hires, Yasmin, who made asynchronous work a religion, and Oliver, who could hold 3 architectural decisions in his head without getting greedy, brought seltzer and a plant I promised I would try not to kill. We ate pasta I'd practiced once and gotten right. We played a card game that required lying with a straight face. Evan lost because he kept laughing at the wrong time. My phone stayed face down on the counter. Nobody knocked. When the candles were candles and then smoke, I cut the cake badly and handed out uneven slices. Someone took a photo. No one tagged anyone else. The house held the sound of people appreciating the same thing at the same time, forced laughter that wasn't careful, the brief quiet after a joke lands. The day after the party, paper plates leaned against each other in the trash, the way all temporary things do. I washed the good dishes. I put the plant on the windowsill and watched it consider the light. At 10, I settled at the dining table with coffee, a contract to review, and the kind of calm that makes dense paragraphs legible. The doorbell didn't ring. The doorbell did not belong to anyone else anymore. Mrs. Ellison waved from her porch around noon, then crossed the street with a bag of lemons she insisted her sister had overbought. "You're settling in nicely," she said, peering over my shoulder as the house staged itself in the available visible space. "Your mother told me you'd be out by now." She smiled, a soft thing with a sharp edge. "Tell her hello if you talk." "I will," I said, because telling is a verb with options. It took 3 more days for my phone to light with Mom. I let it buzz through once. The second time I answered because avoidance is a skill that gets in its own way. "Maya." She used my name like a task. "Mrs. Ellison says you're still at the house." "I am," I said. "That's not possible." Something clattered on her end keys maybe, or a spoon set down harder than necessary. The buyers were supposed to move in last week. Why are you still there? I could have told her about wires and signatures and the sound paper makes when it leaves one folder and enters another. I could have told her about rugs and shelves and a kettle that understood patience. Because it's my house, I said. Our company bought it. We closed. Silence opened and stayed open. Then she laughed once in a way that belonged to a different conversation. Don't be ridiculous. You don't have that kind of money. Wayfinder does, I said. Wayfinder Property Holdings made the purchase. We filed all the right things. The agent's name was Amira Yazdi. She said the name like it was a word from a language she didn't want to learn. If this were true, you would have told us. You told me a day to leave, I said. You didn't ask anything else of me. Another silence. This one carried breath. Why didn't you say you... She stopped and tried a different road. We are your family. You sold the house, I said. You asked me to move out. I followed the instructions. I made sure my tone belonged to a person in a chair. Not a person pushing a boulder uphill. On the other end, something broke that wasn't glass. You watched us pack, she said. You watched us clean and list, and you didn't. The sentence fell apart. When she spoke again, the words had heat around them. Do you have any idea what this looks like? I looked around. Suns across the rug. The bookshelf's quiet confidence. A plant pretending to be braver than it was. Yes, I said. I do. You cannot cut us off like this, she said, and her voice climbed stairs. It hadn't climbed in years. You can't pretend we don't exist. I'm not pretending, I said. I rested my palm on the table to steady the small tremor that came when adrenaline remembered me. I'm living in a house that I own. She made a sound that belonged to old arguments. Where did you get the money? Work, I said. The company. You remember, Evan. We built software. We sold one of our products. We've been building more. A pause. Then flat, how much? Enough. There are numbers I won't hand to people who have treated numbers like levers. On her end, paper shuffled. We could have planned differently, she said softer now, as if she were negotiating a contract with bad terms. We could have. You planned, I said. You did that without me. For a moment, both of us listened to our separate rooms, the sound a house makes being exactly itself. Then she said my name again, not as a task. Maya. I have a meeting in 10 minutes, I said. Because I did, and because an ending sometimes needs a doorframe. I'm hanging up now. You can't. Goodbye. I set the phone on the table and watched the screen go dark and stay dark. My hand shook once, a small aftershock. I got up and opened a window because the room needed a new kind of air. A sparrow landed on the maple and decided against it. In the sink, a spoon leaned against the curve of a bowl. I washed both slowly, then set them in the rack and watched the water make a clean line down the side before it disappeared. I texted Evan. Told her. His reply came fast. Understood. Need me. No, I'm fine. Coffee later. Yes. At my desk, the contract waited with its quiet collection of obligations. I adjusted the chair, found the paragraph I'd been reading, and let the work be what it had always been, a set of instructions that behaved when you honored their logic. The house settled around me, attentive and unhurried. Outside, a delivery truck paused just long enough to decide and moved on. They didn't wait long. On Saturday, tires hissed on the driveway and stopped hard enough to rattle the maple's leaves. Through the peephole, my parents on the step, Kayla behind them and sunglasses Lily, hugging her arms like she'd forgotten a jacket. I opened the door because I don't like speaking to wood. May we come in? Dad asked the sentence, shaped like he was already inside. Yes, I said and stepped aside. They walked into the living room and saw the life that had grown there. The rug caught the afternoon light. The pine bookshelf wore its grain like a map. The new kettle clicked in the kitchen and went quiet. Kayla let out a small, involuntary sound. Lily touched the edge of the coffee table with 2 fingers as if it might be a trick. This must have cost a fortune, Dad said, not unkindly, just measuring. Mom's eyes did the work of cataloging. Explain, she said to the room, then to me. Where did you get the money, Maya? I told you, I said. Wayfinder. Work. How much, Kayla asked, as if numbers would make the walls translate themselves. Enough, I said. Silence shuffled once around the furniture. Then Mom gathered her voice. We've had unexpected expenses, she said, choosing each word like a stepping stone. The mortgage is higher than projected. Kayla's tuition is due. Lily's program fees doubled this term. We're tight. Dad cleared his throat. If you're able to help for a while, he said it would steady things. Lily looked from face to face, then down at her shoes. Kayla broke the quiet. My phone's dying, she said halfway to a laugh. If you can. Stop, Dad said, but he didn't sound like stopping would stick. I sat on the arm of the couch because standing made me feel like a defendant. When I turned 16, I said there was sheet cake on paper plates. When Kayla did, there was a DJ in the yard. At 18, she got a car with a bow. I got a 20 and a note to be careful. Summers you flew to beaches. I watched the house. That isn't fair, Mom said fast, like the speed could reshape the past. It's accurate, I said. I'm not asking for a correction. I'm saying I learned how to survive without asking you for anything, and now you are asking me. That's what families do, Dad said. He didn't meet my eyes. We pulled together. You sold this house, I said, and told me when to be out. We didn't know Mom began. You didn't ask, I said. Kayla exhaled. You're being dramatic, she said. We're just… No, I said, and the word was less a refusal than a frame. I'm being specific. I pay my own bills. I paid rent here when it was requested. I bought groceries when you said to. I've kept to my shelf. I'm not a bank. Mom's hand went to the place on her throat where a necklace would have laid if she'd worn one. We made mistakes, she said, voice thinning. We can fix them. Can? I'm not offering a fix, I said. I'm offering a boundary. I'm not giving you money. Dad took a step toward the bookshelf and found it blocked him without moving. We can be different, he said. He looked like a man who had discovered a locked door in a house he thought he built. Maya, we can be… What you are, I said, is what you chose. I'm not rewriting it. For a long beat, no one spoke. The kettle's metal cooled and clicked once. Outside, a delivery truck downshifted and carried on. Mom reached for Kayla's forearm, missed, and let her hand fall. Please, she said. It was the first time in years the word sounded like the word. Don't do this to us. I'm not doing anything to you, I said. I'm telling you what I won't do. Her eyes filled and steadied without spilling. You would put strangers before us. The people you call strangers, I said, are the ones who showed up. Dad wiped his palms on his jeans. We should go, he said to Mom, but he didn't move. I stood and walked to the door. I opened it and held the edge with my fingers and waited. I'm asking you to leave now, I said, not loud, not soft. If you come back without an invitation, I'll document it. If you keep calling, I'll block the numbers. If you continue, I'll file what I need to file. Kayla laughed once sharp. A restraining order. Against your own parents. If I need to, I said. Lily's mouth opened, then closed. She nodded to no one and everyone. Let's go, she whispered, and the whisper carried. They filed out. On the step, Mom turned as if there were a word left inside her that might change anything. This isn't over, she said, but the sentence sagged under its own weight. It is for me, I said, and closed the door. They did call. Voicemails stacked, Dad's apologies going long, then shorter. Mom's anger flaring, then cooling. Kayla's requests attaching links to phones in 3 colors. Lily's messages the quietest, naming nothing. I didn't answer. When knocking started twice in 1 week, I spoke through the door like a person reading instructions. Leave now. If you don't, I'm calling the police. The knocks stopped. The messages thinned. Eventually nothing. Days filled the space their noise had left. Wayfinder's calendar settled into a rhythm that didn't ask permission to exist. Yasmin brought in a small radio that caught the station with the fewest commercials, and we worked to news of weather and a show about people calling to solve each other's puzzles. Oliver started labeling cables like poetry. Evan cracked the ceiling tiles in one corner with the flat of his palm and replaced them himself because waiting for the landlord would take 2 weeks in Pride. At home, the plant on the sill doubled itself by a brave inch. The bookshelf learned the weight of new manuals, and one novel I read in 3 gulps. I replaced the sedan when the cost of keeping it reliable outpaced the cost of letting it go. I signed papers in a small office that smelled like floor cleaner, and clapped twice alone in a parking lot because sometimes you mark a thing by sounding like a person. In late summer, the maple traded its deep green for something that hinted at a change none of us controlled. I took 3 days off and drove until the road decided to turn into coastline. I stood where water knocked the same way forever and let it. When I came back, the house remembered me. The rug held its pattern. The kettle faithful clicked and breathed. A month later, a message arrived from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Diane, your mother's sister. Coffee." I stared at the name until it made a shape. Aunt Diane had been the voice on holidays who asked about classes and actually listened to the answer, who mailed a postcard from wherever she was because postcards were affordable and better than forgetting. We met at the cafe 2 blocks from the office where the owner wrote orders on craft paper cups in small, tidy cursive. Diane arrived in a blazer that didn't mind being folded over a chair and eyes that took inventory without judgment. We stood for a second, then hugged in a way that acknowledged previous knowledge. "I'm not here to broker anything," she said, palms up after the first sip. "I'm here because I wanted to look at you and see for myself that you're good." "I am," I said. She nodded. "They are not good," she said without decoration. "They made a chain of choices and are surprised by the shape of it. They will probably remain surprised." I watched steam lift and thin. "I'm not moving any furniture for them," I said. "I didn't ask," she said. She set her cup down and leaned in, elbows on the table like we were conspirators. "If you ever want me to tell you stories about your grandmother that your mother never tells, I'll do that. If you don't, I'll send you pictures of the dog I'm fostering this month." "Dog," I said, and felt my mouth figure out a smile without help. We walked back along the block to the corner where we'd split. At the curb, she squeezed my shoulder. "Text me when you want," she said. She didn't say if. She didn't need to. The house at dusk looked the way it always had from the street brick maple, one front step that listed a degree toward the hydrangea. Inside, the air held a day's worth of warmth and the faint ghost of coffee. I set my keys in the bowl and my bag on the chair and my hand on the bookshelf's edge just to feel how solid it was. In the kitchen, the kettle filled and sat, and then spoke in its small voice. I poured the water, turning dark where it met the ground, and stood for a moment in the doorway between rooms, not guarding anything, just witnessing it. Outside, a late cyclist coasted past, chain whispering. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slapped and held. The vents gave their soft prelude and delivered what they promised. I took a sip and let it settle. The house listened to sound I had learned to hear and answered by being itself. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.